Hey everybody, how's it going? Mike and Terry Bowman are on from Indiana on YouTube. Good to see you. Over on Facebook, Derek, hope you and Melissa are doing well. Cheryl's sitting next to me, trying to keep a puppy quiet. Butch Laney, hope you're doing well this evening. David and Janice, good to see you. Sue's back in St. Joe Mo. Was glad to see you. I hope you had a blessed time when you were here, and I'm glad you're back safely. Susan, good to see you this evening. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We're looking at Luke chapter 7 today. Here we go. Kim is on YouTube as well. Good to see you. Probably coming home from work. How's everybody's week's going? How is everybody's week going? Is what I meant to say. Take care of one thing here, and then we will get started. Susan's getting ready to move. When does that happen? Janice has been to the dentist, the doctor. When are you moving, Susan? 7:08, 8 minutes past the hour. A balmy 72 degrees here in Temple, Texas. It says high of 84. I don't think it got that hot today. Maybe that's tomorrow. Getting some fall weather after we had, wow, high was 85 today, it said. Did you know it got that high? No. Cheryl knew. Low tomorrow of 37. High of 56. We get weird weather. Moving December 1st. That is that's coming up in just a couple days. We'll be praying for you and with you for that move, Susan. You can see I got a little scratch here on my face from where my puppy was excited to see me. She's got some razor blade claws, but at least it was done with love. All right. I think we are, we don't have a whole lot of people this evening, but that's okay. We've got who's here, and that's what matters. So we're going to get going. Looking at Luke chapter 7. So we've just finished the Sermon on the Plains, which is Luke's version of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. A lot of repeated information in that. Enough, and we're going to have some decisions that we need to make as we read through the book of Luke, especially since I think we definitely spent more time in Matthew. We did a whole Bible study on the Sermon on the Mount and spent several weeks just going through the 3 chapters in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. But there are so many things that happen in what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then, of course, there's this 4th source I've talked about, which probably turns out to be Thomas, something that we've discovered sort of mid 20th century, but irrelevant who it is exactly, whether that's correct or not. There was a 4th source from which both Matthew and Luke drew information, and Mark was not privy to, Mark having written the first of the Gospels. So the point being that we have very similar stories that happen in Luke that have also happened in Matthew, Mark, and in some cases, John. John is not part of the synoptic gospels. They're a little bit different. John's a little bit different in the way he presents his gospel. Nonetheless, there are some events that occur in all 4, and there are a few that are in John and, say, Luke, but not in Matthew. But here's here's kind of what you have to decide you're comfortable with believing in terms of biblical authority. I don't think it really matters how you move on this. Either there were so many different things that Jesus did that Matthew could talk about one that was really similar to one that Luke talked about, that was really similar to one that Mark talked about, that was similar to one that John talked about, but they were actually 3 or 4 different events, and that's why they're presented to us differently. Or we could possibly accept the fact that they're the same event, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John simply have different things that they want to focus on, and so they tell the story a little bit differently. Especially when you get to somebody like Luke, who's not a primary source. Luke wasn't on the scene when these things happened. And in fact, so many things happened when the disciples had been sent out and came back, and they heard from one another what had happened, and Jesus told them. And I think we're aware that we tend to hear what we want to hear sometimes. And there's 3 sides to every story, as they say. There's the first person side, the second person side, and the truth. When it comes to Jesus, we know that his side will always be the truth, and that might seem to eliminate a side, but often what we have is disciple versus disciple talking about what Jesus said. And so it's one of those 2 things, right? Either a similar healing happened 4 times. Jesus raised someone from the dead in a very similar situation 4 different times, resulting in 4 different things to focus on, or the authors of the Gospels chose to focus on particular things, sometimes to the extent of representing the facts differently. So again, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, what you believe in terms of those 2 choices, or the third or fourth or fifth choice that I'm, not thinking of or don't know to mention. What we have are similar events that happen with different focuses, and so we want to dig into that as we are reading Luke on purpose, right? We intentionally chose Luke because we're going into Acts, so we're especially going to find places where Luke sets up something in his gospel that he's going to pay off in the book of Acts as I see those coming. This will work better for us as a retrospective. So when we get into Acts, we'll be able to look back on Luke a little bit more easily and see those coordinating texts. And Jill's on as well. Good to see you. Jeff might be around somewhere as well. So glad you guys are with us. So we're going to start with chapter 7, and I'll kind of give an example of what I'm talking about. So chapter 7, verse 1. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, so after he had finished his sermon on the plains, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly, and who was ill and close to death. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He's worthy of having you do this for him." So this is interesting, right? This is a centurion, someone that we normally associate with the Roman Empire. Probably not the case in this particular instance, but I'll talk about that more in just a minute. But certainly a member of an occupying army in one way or another, who has a relationship with Jewish elders enough that he's able to send them and asking Jesus to come and heal a slave. And they appreciate the centurion enough that they say, "He's worthy of having you do this for him." So they're kind of vouching for him, for he loves our people, and it's he who built our synagogue for us. And Jesus went with him. I just think this is a very interesting case where we have sort of the occupying force and the occupied force working together in ways to build better society. I'm not sure what to learn from that, but it's unique, certainly, especially when we compare it to the oppression of the Roman Empire. Although a lot of the oppression from the Roman Empire came from the desire not to upset the Jewish ruling classes so that they could avoid any kind of rebellion, that sort of thing. Anyway, Jesus went with them, but when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him to say, "Lord, do not trouble yourself. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you." So this is interesting, and this is probably what's going on here, is a recognition of the centurion, who would not have believed this in a religious manner, probably, but knew the custom well enough to know that it was probable and at least possible that if Jesus were to enter the house of a Gentile, he himself would be made uncleansed by that visit and would have to go through various cleansing rituals afterwards. And he wants to save Jesus from that again, showing a great deal of respect for Jewish customs. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word and let my servant be healed. So here's a man who believes what he's heard about Jesus. He believes that Jesus heals through speech and not through touch. We talked about that last week. That Jesus doesn't have to physically touch someone to heal them, that his very word has the authority to speak. John, I think, presents this concept more firmly than any other gospel writer, when he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and not one thing came into being that did not come into being through the Word. So the Word being the logos, as we read in Greek, being Jesus Christ, is the Word. So that you can kind of plug that in, that when God said, let there be light, that word coming forth was none other than the, the person of Jesus Christ. And then again, at the beginning of creation, we have the winds blowing over the waters as chaos is set to order. So right at the very beginning of creation, we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Not called out as such, not ever called a Trinitarian formula or anything like that in biblical texts, something that came around in 3rd and 4th century Christianity, but nonetheless, a very clear scene, just like the baptismal scenes where you have Jesus in the water, the Holy Spirit descending on him like a dove, and the voice from God, the Father, the Creator, speaking out, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." So, just as an aside, several more places in the Scripture where the Trinity is mentioned not as such, but certainly, again, from a retrospective, from going back, we can understand how the fathers and mothers of our faith came up with this concept of a Holy Trinity. All right. So let me continue checking socials. Okay. Speak only the word and let my servant be healed. For I am also a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. So he's saying, I understand how this power of authority works. I have the authority that all I have to do is tell somebody to do something, and they do it. And so I know that you have more authority than I have. If I can do it, you can do it. You can say, be healed, and this person will be healed. So an awful lot of faith that that the centurion is coming to Jesus with. As I reach into my drawer and grab a antihistamine and drop one on the floor. Okay, I'll get that one later. All right, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. That's quite the statement. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. So let me look through my notes here and see if I've missed anything that I really wanted to talk about. I did mention, I said I would talk about it. The centurion was probably serving Herod Antipas rather than the Romans. So again, still a, well, Herod Antipas, if you can kind of understand the distinction, he was allowed to rule Galilee and some of the surrounding areas like Capernaum in this particular case, which is where Peter is from, by the way, as a sort of a client state of the Roman Empire. So he had a little freedom that the places where the Romans had absolutely come in and been an occupying force had, which allowed him to be a little gentler, I think, which is what we're seeing. Capernaum was a minor trade center and a toll station where roads crossed in Galilee. So here's some differences. Matthew tells this story, and again, are these two different stories, or are they the same story with each author, Matthew and Luke, in these two cases, as I'm speaking now, emphasizing different pieces? I think it's the latter. I don't begrudge you if you believe that it just happened so many times that they picked the stories that match closest with what they wanted to say. I think it's the same story. It just makes sense. It's how the Gospels were assembled. When they were writing their Gospels, they had copies of other Gospels with them. That's why it's significant that Mark was first and Matthew and Luke came out at a very similar time, that sort of thing. So Matthew just records that the boy was paralyzed. Luke describes his condition as a grave illness, certainly seeming to be more towards death than, say, the inability to do work. The earlier healings in Capernaum provide a background for the centurion's request to Jesus. He heard about Jesus. He knew what Jesus' power was, so he sends a delegation of Jewish elders to Jesus. These would have been the town fathers, the distinguished gentlemen of Capernaum, leaders in the very synagogue that this centurion built for them. So the action of the centurion is consistent with the elders' testimony to them, right? He said, the elders say, this man is worthy of this. That if you're going to do this for anybody, it's okay for you to do this for this man. He's really earned it. He built our synagogue for us. He treats us well. So, but again, he's got this understanding where he sends the Jewish leaders instead of coming himself. He says that they don't need to come into his house, all for the purpose of keeping Jesus clean under Jewish law. So just a beautiful, I think, mutual respect in these particular cases. Jesus has a respect for the centurion. No one in Israel has the faith of this man, right? He says, and the centurion certainly has respect for Jesus. And it's that sort of mutual self-respect that I think the book of Luke is based on. Remember, it's the gospel for everyone. It's not just this thing where from the start, it's that Jesus came for the lost sheep, only came for the lost sheep of Israel. And then as time goes on, it seems like Jesus softens up or lightens up or discovers that his mission is for more, which I don't believe any of that. I think Jesus always knew that his mission was for all the world. John certainly knew it. For God so loved the cosmos, the Greek says, that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever should believe in him would not perish but have eternal life. Not for God so loved the Israelites. And John, of course, is full of stories about Samaritans and people that the Israelites looked down upon. And anyway, the point being that from the start, Luke seems to understand that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for the world. It's not for a select group of people. I think that's it. I just want to point out again that Jesus' praise of the Gentile, when he says not one in Israel has this faith, he's not disparaging Israel. He's lifting up, he's elevating the centurion, the Gentile, really, the Gentile population that the centurion stands for. So that's the most important part of that. I think if there's another side of the story that we want to look at, it's the power of Jesus' word. Centurion was a powerful figure, a commander of a military unit of 100 soldiers. That's why it was called a centurion, that century meaning 100. So a centurion had the military control over 100 soldiers with all of the authority of either Herod or Rome. And if he had Herod's authority, it was because it was given from Rome. And with such authority, he was used to having his commands met with just a single command. He told one person. He understood the power of a word. He ordered soldiers and servants. His instructions were carried out. His understanding of power serves as I want to say a parallel to understanding the power of Jesus' word. He doesn't put his own power above Jesus. And rightfully so. He's asking for something he can't do on his own. And so we can remember through the hearing of this story that the Lord we worship is mighty in word, responsive in needs, and compassionate to heal. So that's the first part of our little story here in Luke. Hey, Curtis, good to see you. Dorothy Collier, glad you are here with us as well. Over on YouTube, we got some more folks watching, but they haven't said hi, which is fine. We're glad that you are with us. All right, let's continue on. And now Jesus is going to raise the widow's son at Nain, and this is interesting, I think, because the parallel we get here is not necessarily with Matthew, Mark, or John, but it's actually with a story about Elijah or Elisha. I'm trying to remember which one it is in particular. It's Elijah, sorry. So we're going back now, which is important. It's important for the gospel writers to always go back to the Old Testament to show their belief, their understanding that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament promises, Old Testament prophecy. So let's read this, and then I'll kind of show you the parallels with a story that we have from the book of First Kings, where there's a story about Elijah also healing someone under a similar situation. So soon afterwards, soon after these things, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. So he's starting to drag crowds with him as he goes because they're so impressed with what he's doing. As he approached the gate of a town, a man who had died, okay, this man's dead. He's not grievously injured. He's not paralyzed. He's dead, was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The bier right there is a coffin, right? It's not. We're not talking about. It's BIER. We're not talking about a Bud Light here. We're talking about a coffin. The container in which this dead gentleman was. He came forward and touched the coffin, and the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them. They glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably upon his people." This word spread about him through Judea and all the surrounding country. Now, this is still early in Luke's telling of who Jesus is, and so we don't want to fault them by saying he's a great prophet, especially when I show you how closely this relates to a story in First Kings about Elijah, who was a prophet. And so I think it's very possible that the people who were there noticed the similarities between the two. So I'm going to go back and forth here a little bit for you. Okay, I'm going to read to you from First Kings and then from Luke. So from First Kings, when he came to the gate of the town, Luke 7, as he approached the gate of the town, going back to Kings, she was a widow. Luke, she was a widow. Kings, the son of the widow had died. Luke, the widow's son had died. Elijah cried out to the Lord in Kings. Jesus had compassion for her in Luke. Elijah stretched himself out over the child 3 times. Jesus touched the coffin and said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak. Back over to Kings, the life of the child came into him and he revived. Elijah gave him to his mother, and Luke, Jesus gave him to his mother. The woman said, "Now I know that," this is back in Kings, "now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." And the story in Luke ends, "And Jesus gave him to his mother. The crowd said, 'A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably upon his people.'" So you see how similar these two stories are. And I think very significant here is that, let me make sure. I just don't want to tell you the wrong things. Okay, I'm not going to find this as soon as I want, but I will tell you that in the First Kings story, this woman's son that Elijah raises is not an Israelite. And so I think equally in the book of Luke and Nain that this is another Gentile to which Jesus, for which Jesus performs this miracle, which is another thing that ties the two together very firmly and also reinforces this concept that in the book of Luke, the gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone, and also reinforces the concept that Jesus had the power to heal, to prove that he had the power to forgive. He had the power to change physical manifestations of illnesses and possessions and even death so that people would believe the words that he said. It's the words that he brought to us that were so important, not necessarily the healing. The gospel of Jesus Christ could have been completely filled out if all he ever did was speak. It wouldn't have lessened it. It wouldn't have changed it for us today. But because he was given the power to perform these miracles, people believed that he had the authority to speak the words that he spoke. So that was very important. And we see that that same thing happens in Elijah in First Kings. So I think that's really interesting that Luke tells this story of raising the widow's son in a way that very clearly draws people back to the story of Elijah raising the widow's son in the book of Kings. Keep in mind, in the previous story, Jesus said to the crowd of the centurion, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And now in a story that echoes Elijah's ministry to a non-Israelite, the crowd, sort of functioning like a Greek drama, a chorus, sorry, in a Greek drama, who would sing a refrain, says, a great prophet has risen among us. And then there's a lot more that I could go really deep into that I think I'm going to skip for right now because I think we've taken a fairly good dive into this part of the story. I do want to point out that in this story and in so much of what Jesus talks about and does, death and life are the ultimate polarities of the human condition, right? We're either dead or alive. We're never both, except for it seems where Jesus is concerned. So in both of these cases, the story going back to the widow in Nain in First Kings with Elijah, and in this story with Jesus, and even going back with the story of the centurion, we well, let's go with the widow's sons who have died. We don't know their names. We don't know the ages or the cause of death because in the end of the day, none of that matters. What matters in both cases is that they were widows. They had lost their husbands, and now they had lost their only child. This brings to mind something James, the half-brother of Jesus, will say in his epistle, which is that religion is pure and undefiled before God the Father. Sorry, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress. Had Jesus passed by that funeral procession on the other side when it had the power to stop of it, none of his other works would have made much difference. If religion has nothing to say to the widows, or the least, the last, and the lost, then it has nothing to say. And I think that's significant. I don't personally go too far into that. This can lead down an area of theology called liberation theology, which is a legitimate look at the Bible through the lens of the oppressed. But I think the reason I stay away from it is because I'm a white, middle class, middle aged male. And according to those who would submit liberation theology as sort of the one true theology, I have nothing to learn. I have nothing to teach. So it doesn't do me a whole lot of good to dig into that area. But it's important nonetheless to remember that Jesus, he did things for the middle class of the day. He did things for the Pharisees. He ate with them. He taught them. He spent time with them so that they would understand what he was trying to say. He did that in addition to what he did for the least, the last, and the lost. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that if he hadn't done it for the least, the last, and the lost, it wouldn't really matter that he did it for the middle class or upper class Pharisees. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. I hope I haven't confused it too much by sort of dipping into something I don't want to dive into, if that makes sense. Here's a good quote. The hope of resurrection is not grounded in the fact that the widow's son came back to life, but in the fact that the one who had compassion to bring back the widow's son has himself triumphed over life. And so that really is the resurrections that we read about in Jesus. This widow's son, the girl known as Talitha, which just means little girl, Lazarus, all other places in the Gospels where we read about resurrections. None of those resurrections would have truly mattered had Jesus not conquered death, so that we knew that our ultimate death, because all those people died again, right? So that we had to know that our ultimate death was also wrapped up in the resurrection of Christ. So if not for the resurrection of Christ himself, the other resurrections would lose their power. Okay, so that's a little forward and backward, looking at these stories about Jesus with a couple of resurrections. Okay, let's go on for just a little bit more. I don't think we're going to get all the way through the book of Luke today, but we're gonna go one more section. We're gonna talk about John now. Okay, so Luke 7, verse 18. The disciples of John reported all these things to him. So the disciples of John are there watching this. They're seeing these things that are happening. They go back to John and they say, hey, this might be the guy that you're talking about. These are the things that we've seen. So John summoned two of the disciples and sent them to the Lord, just straight up, to ask, are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? When the men had come, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to ask you, are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? And I love how Jesus addresses this situation. Jesus had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind. And he answered them, go and tell John what you've seen and heard, mind you, something that they had already done. But again, he said, go again, tell them what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. Kind of an interesting way to finish that story, I think. The scriptures replete of, again, the works of Elijah and Elisha, which is why I briefly wasn't sure which one was responsible for the resurrection of the widow's son in Nain, but that was Elijah. But Elijah and Elisha cure the blind, the lame, the lepers, the deaf, the dead, the poor. Isaiah talks about the future prophecy about the blind being able to see, the deaf being able to hear, the lame being able to walk. I don't think he talks about the lepers, the dead being raised, and the good news being proclaimed to the poor. And then, of course, Luke has all of it. Luke's all in on the blind, the lame, the lepers, the deaf, the dead, and the poor. So I think this is very straightforward right here. Hey, Ben, good to see you. Glad you're here with us. I don't think we need to dig into this deep. I want to take just a quick look at that last line. Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. The people who confess Jesus share in the joy that God has shown that God cares about human suffering. It's not just God could easily say, "Hey, this is all temporary," and I know it feels like this is what happens a lot in the world today because we don't celebrate miracles in the way that they celebrated miracles then. We don't have God in a human body walking around making all these things happen. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the leopards clean, the dead rise. We don't have these. We have miracles of modern medicine, which I believe are given to us by God, and perhaps too easily we write those off as scientific miracles and not theological miracles, which might be a little bit easy to do. Certainly, the non-religious portion of the world will borrow the word miracle when it suits them, when they don't want to use it in a theological way. But we are people who believe that God cares about human suffering and doesn't just say, "I don't care what happens to you in this life. All that matters is what happens to you in the next." So we share in the call to follow Jesus and ministering to those to whom God has shown His love. So we share in the call to help the deaf, the blind, the lame, the lepers, the outcasts, the grieving, all of that. The alternate, we can either share in that and join in that, or we can take offense. And so Jesus says, "Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." So if you don't take offense to Jesus, then what you essentially are doing is responding to Jesus' call to follow Him. We've had quite a bit of sermon time dedicated lately to this concept of following Jesus and fishing for people. So those are basically your two options. You can either be offended by the whole thing and say, "Well, Jesus didn't really do these things," or, you're not on here watching this Bible study tonight if you believe that, most likely. But the opposite of taking offense is to actually follow Jesus. There's no in between. You don't get to just say, "Oh yeah, I believe it all, but I'm not going to do any of it myself." That's not what the call to Christianity is. If you believe it, you are changed by it. You are justified by the grace of God. You are sanctified by the grace of God, and you find yourself participating in the works and acts of God without even thinking about it. So you're either offended by the gospel of Jesus Christ, or you end up being a follower of Jesus Christ. Let's continue just a little bit. It's 7:45. We're going to close here pretty soon. I'm going to go just a little bit more because I love what Jesus says about this. When John's messengers has gone, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. So he's speaking to the crowds really about their interaction with John. So remember what happened before Jesus came on in full-blown ministry. John prepared the way. That was his job. That was what had been told would happen, that he would prepare the way for the Lord. And so these people who were following Jesus, many of them had followed John, and that's how they found Jesus. John led them to Jesus. And now, because that's happened, John wants to make absolute sure that Jesus is the person he's supposed to lead them to, because if he's not, he wants to rectify the situation, right? So when John's messengers had gone, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind?" That happens all the time. You can stand in the city square and see a reed shaken by the wind. Why would you have followed John out in the wilderness to see that? So what then did you go out to see? Were you looking for someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who put on fine clothing and live in luxury are in royal places. They're not out in the middle of the desert. I think it's Matthew who reports. Let me see if I can find the section exactly. It's Mark says that he wore a rough camel hair garment as a prophet, right? And he ate locusts and honey. He's a wild guy out in the wilderness. And so he said, "You didn't go out in the wilderness to find fine clothed people. They're royalty. They're in the cities sitting on the thrones. What were you going out into the wilderness to see in the first place? Did you go out to see a prophet? Yes, exactly. That's exactly why you made the trip to the wilderness, because you believed there was a prophet there with something to say. This is the one about whom it is written, "See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you." I tell you, among those born of women, no one is greater than John, yet the least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. And all the people who heard this, including the tax collectors, acknowledged the justice of God because they had been baptized with John's baptism. But by refusing to be baptized by him, the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves. So the ones who went out and followed John and were there and were not there to be changed, were not there to be baptized, were not there to seek what John was leading them to. Remember what John said to them? You snakes and you brood of vipers, who told you to flee from the wrath to come? Why are you here? And he knows that they're there to kind of keep an eye on him, to make sure that he's not teaching things in opposition to what they believed. And of course he's teaching things in opposition to what they believe. That's the same thing they did to Jesus. They followed Jesus to make sure he wasn't teaching things in opposition to what they believed. Of course he taught things in opposition to what they believed. That's the whole point. The whole point is that they had it wrong and Jesus had it right. And before Jesus was John, who was preparing the way. And so Jesus is basically, I think he's saying, why are you even asking John if I am the one who was to come? You heard John, you were there, you went out to be with John to hear what John had to say. Yeah, it's me. I'm the one that John spoke of. I've done all the things that John said I would do. I've done all the things that Isaiah said I would do. I've done all the things that Elijah and Elisha and the other prophets before me did in a way that pointed to who I would be in the future. I've done these things. You went out to the wilderness to find them, and here I am now before you. You don't have to look in the wilderness anymore. You don't have to keep following John. John was here to lead you to me. Now I'm here, so follow me. Not a particular place in the Bible where he says those exact words. But again, you either take offense at the gospel of Jesus Christ, or you take it to heart and you follow Jesus. Those are your two options. And so that's what we have going on here. To what then will I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another, "We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not weep. For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he's got a demon because there's something wrong with him. He's not eating, he's not drinking, so you say he's messed up, he's got a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." He's recognizing that for some, they're not going to choose to follow Jesus. They are going to choose to be offended by the gospel. They're going to be offended by the word and message of Christ, by the way that he brings the word and message. They're going to be offended by John, who led them to Jesus. They're not going to follow. And then he closes this section by saying, nevertheless, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. In other words, just wait and see what's going to happen. Because at the end, John will be vindicated. I'll be vindicated. And those who came to me through John and have chosen not to be offended, but have chosen instead to follow me, will be vindicated. Wisdom is vindicated by all our children. And that is where we're going to stop today. There's not a whole lot more. There's just really one more story in the book of Luke. But it's a very significant story, so I want to hold off until next week, if that's okay with everybody. I don't want to rush us, and I don't want to go too late. So we'll dig into that story next week. Okay? I take your silence as consent. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you, Janice. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Looking forward to digging deeper into Luke. And I don't want to rush through Luke, but I really am looking forward to getting into the book of Acts. It's a book that I have not studied enough. So I'm really looking forward to that time. And I've even in seminary, we didn't go directly from Luke to Acts. We read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then we read John, and then we read Acts. So we had sort of that intermezzo in between them. I'm really looking forward to going directly from Luke into Acts so that we can see where those parallels really are, because Luke certainly went from one straight to the other. So I think we're going to have a really good time when we get to that. Although the book of Acts is not the easiest to get through, but we'll get through it together. All right, everybody, that is it for tonight. So, what can I say? Hope you're having a blessed Advent out in the world. I know it's Christmas time, so I'm hoping you're having a great Christmas. Looking forward to seeing you guys on Sunday in church. Looking forward to seeing you Tuesdays on Bible studies. So, I guess that's it. God bless, Godspeed, and as always, thanks for watching.